Welcome to lecture 3 of structural reliability. I am Trisha Chakraborty, a second year PhD student at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. And this course, Structural Reliability, is a part of the PMRF ISS's teaching program. I will start with the topics to be covered. We have in the first lecture we have looked at review of probability theory, probability and statistics as well. That forms a very important basis of structural reliability, because reliability has to do with uncertainties, and to model uncertainty mathematically, we take the parameters that we want not to be deterministic, and then we model them as random variables, and random variables is what we are taught in statistics to see their modeling the distributions, the mean variance, and to see probability of failure calculations. Probability and statistics is very important, and so lecture 1 was basically a prerequisite for this course. Then, in the last class, we defined the limit state function and derived partial safety factors. We saw how limit state design works and how we obtain partial safety factors. That means that there will be a partial safety factor on capacity and one on the demand. On the demand, we will apply a partial safety factor greater than 1, and on the capacity, we'll apply one less than 1, that is on the denominator. And then the basic limit state will be that the factor demand should be less than the factor capacity. That means that the limit state has not failed, and the reverse means that the limit state has failed. And failure of probability of failure is is estimated sometimes numerically, sometimes analytically, as the failure of as a percentage of failure of the limit state. Then there are simulation methods for studying reliability, with special emphasis on Monte Carlo methods. These are the numerical methods. This we are going to look at next class. And here, Monte Carlo simulations, what they do, it is basically a statistical method. It is that we are going to generate our system a large number of times, and then we are going to see how many times our limit states are failing, and then the ratio of the number of times it failed divided by the total number of times we ran the simulation will be our probability of failure. And this works on the principle that my number of trials in, as one of the axiomatic definitions of probability, that as my denominator or the number of trials tends to infinity, the ratio of ratio of my event occurring divided by the total number of trials approaches the probability of that event occurring. And here my event may be my probability of failure. So failure is my event, and also a very important aspect of structural reliability is to define failure, because failure is not just defined for a complicated structure. Maybe for a very simple structure like a spring or a beam, maybe they are obvious, but even then the limit states are not that obvious, because we have to put certain limits on the deflection, the serviceability limit states. Then we are going to see that the material does not yield, or whether the material does not fracture, and there will be different modes that get stress to develop in the beam, like bending shear, torsion, axial, and so on. So all of these have to be accounted for, and then we as the reliability engineer have to take a call about which failures I'm concerned with. Some of the failure modes we may even ignore, because, for example, in a beam we generally do not bother much about the shear deformation, because shear is so less. From experience we know that the flexural mode of failure is much more severe than the shear mode of failure. So maybe only flexural collapse will be defined as failure of the beam. Additional to that, there may be some kind of deflection criteria on the tip of a cantilever or the midpoint of a simply supported beam. Anyway, once we have defined the failure, we can apply numerical methods like Monte Carlo methods to find the probability of failure. And then there are some analytical methods which we are going to look at in lecture 5 next week Wednesday. There are the second moment and transformation methods, include forms on first order reliability methods, second order reliability methods, and there are some transformation methods like Natev, Rosenblatt, etc. We are going to look at that next class. And these are analytical methods of estimating reliability. And then finally, in lecture 6, that is Thursday of next week, I think 3rd October, we are going to look at system reliability. And now, before that, in all the lectures, we are going to just work with a single element. A single element means a single limit state. It means it doesn't even mean a beam, because a beam may have multiple limit states. We are just going to be concerned with one limit state. For example, the flexural limit state, that is the flexural stress, the maximum flexural stress developed in the beam should be less than the yield stress of my material. That is how we are going to define one limit state, and we are going to study reliability on that, whether we are studying Monte Carlo next class or analytical methods next to next class. And then finally we are going to look at the system modeling kind of thing, that when in reality no structure has just one limit state, and the structure is also made physically of so many elements, like a building has floors, beams, columns, walls, foundation, and so on. And each of those elements, there are so many elements connected physically. Then each of those elements have so many limits that are connected logically. And that's what we are going to try to discern in the final lecture, lecture 6, system reliability. This is the course structure. Module 1, that is already over last week, consisted where we looked at review of probability theory, measures of structural reliability, partial safety factors, and the limit state function. Module 2 is this week, today and tomorrow. We're going to look at types of uncertainty, risk assessment, probability of failure. Or this part is kind of theoretical. So today's lecture deals like modeling uncertainty, like what kind of uncertainties are we concerned with, because the mathematical part comes afterwards. First we have to see the sources of uncertainty and how we are going to which factors we are going to consider, how we are going to assess or quantify risk, and the probability of failure, how that is related. And then comes the numerical or the calculation part, the mathematical part, the integration and simulation method, special emphasis on Monte Carlo method, and variance reduction. Variance reduction is a technique that is used to save computational cost, because Monte Carlo methods are really expensive, because to generate a large system 10 to the power 5, 10 to the power 6 times takes a lot of time. And variance reduction techniques help with that. Like we can identify the region of failure, and we are going to see that most like we are going to generate less number of samples, but those samples will be biased in the failure region, so that we can get an accurate probability of failure with lesser number of generations. Those are what we are going to see: Latin hypercube sampling, importance sampling, and so on. And the next week we have module 1, that is one for one class, the second moment and transformation methods, the analytical ones, Hasefer-Lind, Nataf and Rosenblatt transformations, first order reliability methods, and second order reliability methods. And the final module is one class, that is system reliability, load, material, and system modeling, series and parallel systems, and if we get time, response surfaces. Series and parallel systems are, we may have looked at that in high school maths, but or high school signal processing or something. Series and parallel systems are logical connections basically. So maybe I may have mentioned it once earlier, that if I have a bar that is connected by two springs like this, like two springs, then a bar is connected. That means that even if one spring fails, the other spring will hold up the bar. So that means that this system, this is a parallel system. It means that even if both my if my the springs are the limit state, the springs failing or not failing is my limit state. So that means that both strings have to fail for my system to fail. So both, if the requirement is both elements have to fail for the system to fail, it is a parallel connection. And if it is like the strings are attached end to end and then there is a bar or a ball, that means that if one spring fails, irrespective of whether the other spring is intact, my system will collapse. So that is a series connection. That means that only one failure is enough for the system to fail. So then these are purely series and purely parallel systems. And then there are mixed systems, because there will not be just two elements. There will be most systems will have, sorry, most systems will have connections of a large number of elements, and this they will be connected partially in series, partially in parallel. Identification of those are what we are going to look at in the last class. And this course is going to have a special focus on civil engineering. And because civil engineering is but the reliability is also very important in some other applications like aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, but this course has a special inclination to civil engineering, because that is what my specialization is. And that topic is commonly called risk and reliability, and it has seen a lot of research work in the past century, from 1940s, 50s, 1930s maybe it started the work on reliability. Reliability is still a developing topic, though now it has kind of saturated. And reliability in a lot of international codes, like the European codes, the American codes, the AISC, EN codes, have explicitly incorporated reliability considerations in their codes and their like provisions. But the Indian codes are yet to do that. They have not included it explicitly, but though there is some implicit implications there. But hopefully in the next few years or in the next few decades, Indian codes will also incorporate that. Okay, so today's lecture 3 is structural reliability assessment. The introduction to this topic, we to look at some terms. The term reliability that the course is based on, it is commonly defined as the complement of the probability of failure. Probability of failure (PF) is, and 1 minus PF is a fraction, right? It should be something of the order of 10 to the power minus 3, 10 to the power minus 4. The 1 minus that is the reliability. Of course, less the probability of failure or higher the reliability is, the safer my structure is. Probability of or reliability is also called the probability of safety or proper performance of the structure over a given period of time. And risk, I talked of this phrase risk and reliability that is commonly used. So I'm defining reliability and risk. Risk has two meanings in the context of structural engineering. The first meaning is equivalent to the probability of the structural failure from all possible causes, both from violation of predefined limit states and from other causes. So what happens is that we are considering certain limit states, we are considering a large set of limit states maybe, but we it's rarely possible that we can consider the exhaustive set of limit states. Like everything, structures behave so in a such a complicated manner that and sometimes unexpected as well, that at no point can we say with full confidence that we have covered all our limit states. So there can be some other causes, some limit state that we hadn't considered, or some limit state that we hadn't even foreseen. Like that is how structural engineering or civil engineering develops from failures. Like catastrophic failures in the past have sometimes taught us a lot, like the Ronan point failures, were sparked of the start of research of progressive collapse. Though it was a terrible event and it also led to the death of a few people, but in the long run, it, like, failures do teach us a lot in the context. So that is how civil engineers should take it. So that means that there can be other causes than what we know, because our knowledge at no point can be considered to be complete. That is a very arrogant statement, we can never say that. The second interpretation of the word risk refers to the magnitude of the failure condition, usually explained in money terms, and is commonly used in connection with insurance. This will not be used here because this is mostly a different kind of consideration. It's not a mathematical consideration, it is an economic consideration. So we have what the term risk that we mean is the failure, like the probability of structural failure. But like we say that we are, for example, in gambling, the risk of losing money, or the risk of losing a game. That kind of interpretation is the second one, but the first one is just the probability of structural failure from all possible causes. Structural failure, again, that is also very important to define because it is not predefined or not very obvious. The occurrence of one or more types of undesirable structural responses, including the violation of predefined limit states, but not limited to it. So that means that violation of predefined limit states are definitely structural failure, but there could be other structural failure as well, like anything that anything that hampers the purpose for which the building was made is can be termed as a structural failure. But we cannot account for all of them mathematically. We are only working with the limit states. And now we are going to look at identifying uncertainty. The uncertainty is mentioned in lecture 1, where the load acting on a structural element and its resistance. We have looked at that to see that, like how they are modeled using random variables. Like very briefly, we have looked at it. So the uncertainties are basically under a broad umbrella, the loads and the resistances. More generally, a range of uncertainty may need to be considered, like environmental condition, workmanship and human error, prediction of future events. Like we have looked at the return period last class, that works that is an average kind of time before an extreme event occurs, like a flood or a tsunami or an earthquake. So all of these predictions and environmental conditions, for example, in the Indian Standard Code for Steel Design IS 800, there are some factor of safeties on the material, that 1.1 I think for in welding, 1.1 for shop welding and 1.25 for site welding. That means that we are inherently assuming that if my structure is welded at in a shop, it is under more controlled conditions, so I am applying a lesser factor of safety. And if it is in the site, there are many more factors that we are not being able to account for, so we are applying a larger factor of safety, and all these factor of safeties come from the reliability studies. So that is how environmental conditions, workmanship, human error come from. And identification of uncertainties for complex system may be difficult because there are so many aspects to be considered. A systematic scheme used to help to enumerate all operational and environmental loading states, and for each to consider possible combinations of error or malfunction. This is what identifying uncertainty is, that we need a systematic scheme that will help us to enumerate, means like to write down mathematically all operation and environmental loading states, and to consider the possible combination of error or malfunction, where is that is a violation of limit state kind of thing. Then there are two broad categories of uncertainty that are commonly looked at in all standard reliability textbooks: epistemic uncertainty and aleatory uncertainty. Epistemic uncertainties arise from lack of or from gaps in our knowledge. To reduce epistemic uncertainty, we require more investigation of the basic phenomenon or issue so as to improve understanding. So epistemic uncertainty can be eliminated the more and more we investigate or we work into knowing the behavior of my structure. But aleatory uncertainty covers uncertainties intrinsic to the component or system being considered. They can be reduced with gathering of additional data or information, improve numerical or other modeling, and better parameter estimation. While much has been made of the difference between these two broad classes of uncertainty, it is clear that both represent incomplete states of knowledge, whether it is in understanding or in data. Epistemic uncertainty is about lack of understanding, while aleatory uncertainty is about lack of data. But both of them come from lack of knowledge, so they can be reduced in some senses. There is a very famous quote by Frandl Thal. Look at that once. So this is it, that it's Frandl Thar, who is one of considered one of to be one of the pioneers or fathers of structural reliability. He said in one of his papers that with increasing perfection of design methods, the element of ignorance can largely be eliminated, but the element of uncertainty is caused by circumstances that can be changed to a certain extent but never be removed. So that this ignorance is what aleatory and epistemic uncertainties are about, but uncertainty can never be removed completely. This is a broad categorization of the types of uncertainty, decision, and they lead to phenomenological uncertainty, modeling, prediction, statistical, physical, human factors, and all of these are connected in some ways. Like physical uncertainties are connected to statistical uncertainty, human factors are also connected to statistical, and we are going to look at the definition of all these basic broad categories, starting with phenomenological uncertainty. Sometimes an apparently unimaginable phenomenon occurs to cause structural failure. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was apparently one such case. It means that unimaginable means that we have just not foreseen that kind of, like that cause or that kind of failure, and That may be due to lack of experience in the past. Like every passing year we gather more and more knowledge about structural behavior, and that may be something that couldn't be that is very obvious to us today. Maybe it could not be imagined 100 or 200 years back. So the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was one case of an unexpected kind of failure. Like there was some kind of like there was a lot a high wind blowing that day, and the frequency of the bridge somehow caused a resonance with the wind frequency, and it the bridge vibrated excessively. Like it was unbelievable. Even today we cannot imagine a bridge vibrating so much. What happened in the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, and then it finally collapsed due to excessive vibration. It was also of a design that departed considerably from earlier suspension bridge designs. So it is a suspension bridge. It was, and today there are so many suspension bridges. So we have kind of a benchmark or a blueprint for suspension bridges. But the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was a design that departed, that was kind of different from what earlier suspension bridges were. So that was one factor leading to an unimaginable phenomenon, because no, if no one has built such a structure before, no one knows what kind of failure modes can arise. Phenomenological uncertainty may be considered to arise whenever the form of construction or the design technique generates uncertainty about any aspect of the possible behavior of the structure under construction, service, or extreme conditions. Construction phase is the first phase before it is put to use. The service condition is when the structure is working in its own life period. Like for a bridge, it is 100 years, 150 years. And extreme conditions are when extreme loading conditions like an earthquake, a flood, or extreme wind, all of these are extreme conditions. And this is very important. It is of particular importance for novel projects or those which attempt to extend the state of the art. This means novel projects mean that the structure that doesn't have enough predecessors to know the behavior properly. Everything we are doing is by prediction, not from actual experience. So if we are taking an attempt to extend the state of the art, making a new kind of structure or a new aspect of a structure, phenomenological uncertainty is an important aspect that must be considered. Then there is another called decision uncertainty. Um, Decision uncertainty arises in connection with the decision as to whether a particular phenomenon has occurred. In terms of limit states, it is concerned purely with the decision as to whether a limit state violation has occurred. Because as I said, limit state violations are not so easy to discern, because they have to be defined very like so that they have no loopholes. A typical example concerns crack widths or deflections. Now, a deflection limit, I can decide to put a deflection limit on that in the midpoint of a beam to 5 millimeter. Someone else might say it is 7 millimeter. So that is a decision we have to take. For my case, a deflection of 5.5, I will say that my deflection limit state has failed, but for another person might say it has not failed. So it is in general, it is unlikely in general that a slight increase in either will suddenly render the structures are unsafe or unserviceable. At most, it is a question of relative loss of structural usefulness. So it is a subjective call. That there will be some basis. Of course, no one is going to put a deflection limit of 1 meter. Of course not. It will be something of the range of a few millimeters, but that is a subjective call the engineer has to take. So that is where the decision uncertainty comes in. One way in which decision uncertainty might be formulated is using an indicator function J. That this shows that if indicator function is a function that is zero in case suppose indicator function of one event E is set to be 1 when when the event has occurred, and 0 when the event has not occurred. So here my event will be my limit state failing. So if it has failed, I will call my indicator function 1, and if it is not failed, I will call it 0. Decision uncertainty might be formulated also in the terms of a probability density function for the uncertain criterion. Then there is modeling uncertainty. Modeling uncertainty is associated with the use of one or more simplified relationship between the basic variables to represent the real relationship or phenomenon of interest. So this is very important, because whatever we are modeling, whenever we are modeling a parameter as a random variable, whether whenever we are making assumptions like this is a normally distributed random variable, or these two random variables or these two parameters are independent, or they have this amount of correlation between them, all of these are things that we are approximating. Of course, of course there will be some basis to the approximation, but after all it is an approximation. No one actually can say that my young that my density is going to be a random variable with this mean, and the mean maybe I can say that because that is expected value, but the standard deviation, the distribution, we cannot say that exactly that it is going to be a normal random variable. We are taking a call on that. In its simplest form, modeling uncertainty occurs the uncertain concerns the uncertainty in representation of physical behavior, such as through the limit state equations. Modeling uncertainty is often simply due to lack of knowledge, because see, lack of knowledge, and it is not the fault of the engineer, because at some we do not have infinite knowledge. We cannot say anything with complete guarantee, but it can be reduced with research or increased availability of data. Suppose we have undertaken the density distribution of 10,000 steel bars, and all of these we see them to be following a normal distribution trend. It cannot be exactly, but following a normal distribution trend with a standard deviation of 2.5%. Then it is logical to that we can accept that, or we can average out the standard deviation, or the mean. But if we just have one or two samples that we have tested, and then on based of that we are one of them follows a normal distribution or a log normal, so we just say it's log normal with this amount of standard deviation, that may not be accurate. So a lot of research and increased availability of data is going to give us better idea about the trends, and the modeling uncertainty will be reduced. Modeling error is here shown in the form of a diagram: response versus parameter. This is the experimental observation, the cross ones. So the cross, see, there will be some off value, some outlier values, and this is the experimental mean, and this is the model mean. There will be some difference. The model mean is what we are assuming, and the experimental mean is what we are getting. So as we increase and increase and increase the number of experiments, they are eventually going to coincide. Modeling uncertainty can be incorporated into a reliability analysis by introducing a modeling variable chi-m, say to represent the ratio between actual and predicted model response or output, as shown here. Here, chi-m may be represented by probability density function, or simply as a mean and standard deviation, that is a second moment representation. So this is called a second moment representation when we do not define the probability density, we just say the mean and the standard deviation. We don't mention the distribution type. A convenient approach where both the model and the actual phenomenon are measured by the same type of variables. For example, crack deflection, crack width. This and however, if structural system capacity of behavior is modeled by an individual member capacity or member, there usually will be a considerable amount of variability depending on the type and the degree of static indeterminacy of the structure. So, we I'll give you a minute to observe this and uh, see if you can figure out what this diagram is actually saying. Prediction uncertainty. Many problems in structural reliability assessment involve the prediction of some future state of affairs. In this case, the prediction of the reliability of some structures at some time t greater than 0 in the future. That means an estimate of structural reliability depends on the state of knowledge available to the analyst. So, for example, weather conditions can change in in the next 50 years. Weather conditions are going to change, so that can change the patterns of the ocean water movement, or the snow, or the glacier movement, or anything. So if they are creating building an offshore structure today, for 100 years, then we have to make some predictions about how the oceans are my ocean is going to behave in the next 100 years. There will be some kind of things that we cannot predict from now, or there are some things that we can predict with the present knowledge we have, and the trends that we have seen. As new knowledge related to the structure becomes available, the estimate will become more refined. That is very natural. For example, what we know about the climate in the next 20 years is more than what we knew 100 years back. So this is an ever evolving process, particularly during the construction phase of a process, when information about the actual strength of materials, workmanship, etc. becomes available to replace estimates based on the past performances and experiences with similar structures. So this should be evolved. In suppose in the construction phase we have acquired a new knowledge or insight about the material that we are using, about the limit states, about some new kind of machinery or something. So those should be incorporated in an iterative manner. When the structure is placed in service, its response to initial loading or perhaps to proof loading will constitute further information from which the reliability estimate may be revised. Because we are, of course, we are assuming this load will come on the structure. Based on that, we have done an reliability analysis. But when it is actually in service, and the initial dead load, live loads come, not the extreme events. The extreme events are not considered here. When the what we have designed it for actually is withstood by the structure, there will be some kind of response in the sense the stresses develop, the deflections occurring. They will give us more information about how the structure is actually behaving, not what we predicted it. So that will give us more information, and the reliability estimate can be revised. It is clear that the probability estimate is not only a function of the properties of a structure, but also a reflection of the analyst's knowledge of the structure and the forces and influences likely to act on it. Similarly, if a reliability estimate for a particular structural lifetime is required, the analyst's uncertainty in the prediction of that lifetime, as well as the loadings that might be expected during that time, enter into the uncertainty of the reliability estimate. Then there are physical uncertainties. Physical uncertainty is that identified with the inherent random nature of a basic variable. Examples include variation in steel yield strength, variability of wind loading, variability of actual floor loading, physical dimensions of a structural component. All of these we we have a design, and uh, we have some stipulated dimensions that we are going to give to the structural elements. But in reality, it is rarely possible that if I want my floor to floor height to be 3 meter, it will be exactly 3 meters. There could be a difference, or an inaccuracy of 1 2 millimeters, right? Then yield strength, during suppose in steel design, we assume the yield strength to be 250 MPa. But if but in no industry, nowhere can we actually guarantee that every steel component, every specimen that we are developing and using, like building and using, will have exactly yield stress of 250 MPa. It could be something less, something more. And loading, of course, loading is completely what we are assuming, and loading we can never completely predict. We are assuming that the wind speed in this zone is for 30 meter per second. It can exceed it someday. And the actual floor loading, like in especially in institutional buildings, in malls and all, there are guidelines about the live loads, and we generally approximate it on the higher side. But still, on an extraordinary, there could be an extraordinary event when one day there is extremely high live load on one floor. So these are the inherent random nature of a basic variable. Physical uncertainty might be reduced with greater availability of data, or in some cases, such as with yield strength, with greater effort in quality control. Now, of course, quality control will, if we put more efforts in the factories, if we put more efforts in quality control and we actually test every specimen, and we reject the ones that have yield stress less than what we are saying it is, then the uncertainty can be reduced. However, usually it cannot be eliminated, as is evident for natural phenomena such as wind loading, snow loading, or earthquake loading. Uh, this is, of course, we just simply cannot say that this is the maximum magnitude of earthquake that can ever come in this zone. We can never say that. It is completely up to nature. We can just make a prediction. And generally, the physical uncertainty for any basic variable is not known a priori and must be estimated from observation of the variable or assessed subjectively. Subjectivity is a very important part in engineering, because there are so many calls that we have to take as an engineer, and two engineers may will not arrive at the same design, even if they are even if they have the same knowledge. Two engineers will mostly always arrive at a different design. So that, but experience helps. Experience make us make better and better guesses and approximations. A priori means before, like before construction, before design, or before reliability calculations. The next topic is statistical uncertainties. Statistical estimators such as the sample mean and higher moments can be determined from available data and then used to suggest an appropriate probability density function and associated parameters. This means that this is how that when we are modeling a random variable, we have to give a mean, we have to give a standard deviation, we have to decide upon a density function that could be normal, log normal, Gumbel, Frechet, Weibull. All these are what we are using. This is what a statistics is. Generally, the observation of the variable do not represent it perfectly, and as a result, there may be bias in the data as recorded. In addition, different samples datasets will usually produce different statistical estimators, and this causes statistical uncertainties. Because sample data sets are also biased, right? Because if I take if I study 50 steel samples, we will get a certain distribution, a certain standard deviation. If we study another 50, we are not going to get the exact same standard deviation. So, or there will be an inherent kind of statistical uncertainty included here. Statistical uncertainty can be incorporated in a reliability analysis by letting parameters such as the mean and the variance and other parameters which describe the probability distribution themselves be random variable. So we are going to allow a standard deviation on the standard deviation and on the mean. So generally in simple stationary analysis, we assume that for each random variable the mean and the variance is fixed, but there is a non-stationary analysis which is an even more wider, it as is a wider umbrella, where the mean variance are themselves considered to be random variables, so that accounts for even more uncertainties. Alternatively, the reliability analysis might be repeated using different values of the parameter to indicate sensitivity. That is also another thing that is done, that the mean is not taken fixed, the standard deviation is not taken fixed. We are going to repeat the analysis with different combinations of mean and standard deviations, and we are going to see how much the reliability varies. So, suppose if we see that just changing the mean a little bit increases or decreases the reliability a lot, that means that this sensitivity is really that this my structure or system is really sensitive to that parameter, and then that parameter we have to put even more efforts in controlling that parameter. This is an example. Consider cylinder test results for a concrete of specified nominal strength as delivered by a number of concrete suppliers. To achieve the required nominal strength, some suppliers with less control or quality will aim for a higher mean strength to counter the greater variability of their product. There will also be variability due to between batch variability for any one supplier, and variability due to the casting and testing of the test cylinders. So this is just a kind of a case study. Uh, See if you understand the problem first. What this statement means: to achieve the required nominal strength, some suppliers with lesser control or quality will aim for a higher mean strength to counter the greater variability of this product. Why is this so? we look at the solution. It is clear that the probability distribution that can be developed for concrete cylinder strength will depend on the manner in which each of these uncertainties contribute to the strength being measured. So, if one supplier is changed or deleted, the record is histogram, and hence the inferred probability distribution function for concrete strengths would be expected to change. Ideally, sampling should be on homogeneous samples, that is those for which there is no evidence of non-homogeneity, with other factors separately sampled and perhaps included in a combined distribution model if required, thus restricting attention to only two different suppliers. The probability density function for the concrete strength, irrespective of supplier, is given by this probability density function is q1 f1 plus q2 f2, where q1 plus q2 is 1, so that means it will be kind of a ratio. So if q1 is zero point 0.4, q2 will be zero point 0.6, and the integral of this function will be q1 integral f1 plus q2 integral f2, and since integral of f1 and f2 are individually 1, this q1 plus q2 has to be 1 to make this 1, because the integral of a probability density function should be 1. So here q1 and q2 represent the representative contributions of supplier 1 and 2, having concrete strength probability distribution function f1 and f2 respectively. So a change in f1 q1 or q2 changes fc. So if I have more data from samples for supplier 1, more contribution, so that q1 will increase and vice versa. Then there are uncertainties due to human error. Human errors can be divided roughly into errors V due to natural variation in task performance, and gross errors EG, as in the table in next slide here. Gross errors might be considered into Gross errors might be considered again in two categories: those errors which occur in the normal processes of design, documentation, construction, and use of the structure within accepted procedures, and those which are a direct results of ignorance or oversight of fundamental structure or service requirements. So, see, this is error factors in observed failure cases. Uh, Ignorance, carelessness, negligence are 35%. Forgetfulness, errors, mistake are 9%. All of these will add up to 100. Reliance upon others without sufficient control. For example, we are going to trust the supplier that they are saying that the standard deviation of of the steel sections are 2.5%. We just accept it without testing ourselves or making a call ourselves. So that is underestimation of influences, 13%. Insufficient knowledge, 25%. Objectively unknown situations or the unimaginable situations, like like the wind situation in the Tacoma Narrows bridge failure, 4%, and remaining 8%. Prime causes of failure here: inadequate appreciation of loading conditions or structural behavior, 43%. That is the most important one. Then mistakes in drawing or calculations, 7%. That is same as negligence basically. Inadequate information in contract documents or instructions, 4%. For example, the soil capacity, the civil engineer is given the structural engineer is given the soil capacity as a prerequisite, and that is what they assume. But what if the soil report itself was erroneous? Then contravention of requirements in in contract documents or instructions, 9%. Inadequate execution or erection procedure, 13%. Unforeseeable misuse, abuse, or sabotage, catastrophe deterioration, 7%. Random variation in loading, structure, materials, workmanship, 10%, and others, 7%. In his classic definition discussion of the problem, Pugsley considered that the main factors which affect proneness to structural accidents are new or unusual materials, new or unusual methods of construction, new or unusual types of structure. All three are different. Though they have to do with novelty, they are all different aspects of structure. Experience and organization of design and construction teams. So a more experienced team is of course is likely to perform better than a team that has no experience. Research and development background: the more research, the latest research that is being incorporated, that will give us a better estimate. Financial climate, industrial climate, political climate, all these are very debatable factors, but all of these do actually affect it. Like, for example, the political climates, they affect, for example, during the world wars, the amount of materials that were the kind of materials that were used, the amount of materials that were allowed to be used, there was rationing of materials, right? So there was a lot that was a very different scenario from what it is now. And again, first world countries will have more more amount of money to spend on safety. This is also a very important topic of debate. that the safety standards, acceptable safety standards, or how much people are prepared to pay for safety are calculated. There is a method called the life quality index, LQI, that has to do with how much the common people are ready to pay for safety. And it is of course found that since the economic condition of the first world countries are better, they are ready to pay more for safety. So but that so that kind of calculation, it incorporates the economy of the country, the per capita income and so on of the people of the place that we are seeing. So that is financial climate. For these reasons, and because errors may be detected, the integrated effort of the quality of performance in several micro tasks of error occurrence and of error detection is of interest. The output from the performance of a macro task, such as design loading calculation, has been studied and tends to show rather less variation than that observed for micro tasks. Human intervention. There are the factors that how human intervention affects reliability are education, work environment, complexity reduction, personal selection, self-checking, external checking and inspection, legal sanctions. So see if you can understand every term here. Quality assurance. The various approaches to the reduction of gross human error should not be seen in isolation. In any engineering projects, they should be viewed as complementary techniques to achieve a desired goal. Usually, this is the achievement of a safe and satisfactory project of sufficiently low cost and sufficiently high utility over the required design life. Use of the above techniques together with establishment of appropriate managerial and organizational structures, establishment of systems for material compliance testing, etc., and the selection of appropriate nominal safety measures may be given the umbrella title of quality assurance. This term, in common with other non-structural projects, a useful approach to achieve this is the institution of a safety plan. This is based on a detailed hazard scenario analysis. The safety plan is then used to lay down the requirements to be met by the quality assurance procedures. In the case of structural engineers, these would include, this is the source, proper definition of functions, definitions of tasks, responsibilities, duties, adequate information flow, structural design brief, control plans and checklists, documentation of accepted risks and supervision plan, inspection and maintenance plan, and the user instructions. Now the term hazard management, we have seen the hazard scenario is important. So hazard management is a particularly important in low probability high consequence situations. That hazard, that means that earthquake, an earthquake is has a very low probability of occurring, but if it does, if suppose an earthquake of a high magnitude has a very low probability of occurring, but if it does, it will have catastrophic consequences. So it is very important, hazard management is a very important issue. Typically these are situations where the risk is just to be extremely low, but if the event does occur, the consequences are likely to be devastating. For example, nuclear accident, earthquake events in intraplane plate regions, and other traditionally low risk areas are another. Moreover, even if the immediate hazards from an event cannot be completely controlled or significantly reduced, the situation after the event might be managed appropriately. For example, following the January 1994 Kobe earthquake in Japan, it has been realized that controlling the immediate consequence of a rare earthquake, building collapses, etc., may not be practical, as this would involve very high and politically unacceptable upgrading costs for the existing infrastructure. So immediate consequences means that if a rare earthquake of a very high magnitude does occur, and if we want to design for against an extremely high magnitude earthquake, the structure is going to become very uneconomical, because the demands of that, if it takes such a high demand, the capacity of the structure is going to be required to be very high, and that is not possible, that is unacceptable, because economy is also a very important practical factor that we have to consider. Though safety is our first priority when as structural engineers, we have to conform with the economical and the political guidelines. So that it has been realized that controlling the immediate consequence of a rare earthquake is not possible, but appropriate systems should be in place to control the subsequent hazards, that is, those associated with rescue and emergency operations and disease control. So if such a bad earthquake comes, there will be immediate damage, and we cannot, but like after a point we cannot do anything about that. We have designed for an earthquake of certain magnitude, and an earthquake of a much greater magnitude comes. We have to accept, as structural engineers, we have to accept that there is nothing we can do about that, because we didn't foresee that coming, and we cannot design for the highest magnitude of earthquake ever possible. But there should be systems in place like rescue operations, relief programs, rehabilitation programs, so that the term damage control comes, that if there is a damage, okay, but we should look at how we can control and relatively minimize the impact of the damage. Now we move into the mathematical part, the calculation of probability of failure. A comprehensive estimate of failure probability must be able to incorporate both types of probability information, assuming that the events described by point estimates are independent of those described by probability density functions. The combined subjective estimate of the structural failure probability is given by PF is 1 minus PE P naught, where PE is the probability of human error occurrence, P naught is the conditional probability of system failure without human error occurrence. So 1 minus PE is the complement, that means that human error has not occurred, and multiplying that with the conditional probability, we get the actual probability of system failure, and P1 is the conditional probability of system failure given the occurrence of human error. So this is basically the total probability theorem. PFV represents the failure probability as a function of random variables with probability distributions, and PFU is a failure probability as a function of events for which only point estimates of probability are available. So, adding these two is also an exhaustive set, and adding these two is also an exhaustive set. So, they both should be approximately equal, and either of these should give the probability of failure of the system. In common with most fields in which risk analysis is applied, the view taken here is that all probabilities are subjective or Bayesian to some degree. The term PFV can be evaluated with the aid of the total probability theorem. PFV is sigma PFI PI I goes from 1 to n. where PFI is PF given Ni, that is a conditional probability that given that the ith state of nature Ni occurs, and Pi equal to small pi equal to capital Pni is the probability of occurrence of that ith state of nature. So I am considering So what I'm doing is I'm considering n states of nature. For example, this kind of loading, the n loading conditions, and n or n combinations of loading and resistances. So that so p and p pi is a probability of each of those n states of nature, and pfi is the probability of failure given that this state has occurred. So this is the total probability theorem. PFV is sigma p I equal to 1 to n pf given ni p ni. We have looked at this in the first lecture. This is another example. It is estimated that the probability of accidental traffic overload event n1 for a small bridge is 0.01. When that occurred, the conditional probability of failure of bridge is zero point 0.1. Under normal loading conditions, the probability of failure is 0.002. In addition, it is possible for flooding to occur event N2 independently of the traffic loads applied to the bridge. The probability that this occurs at a magnitude sufficient to cause failure is estimated as 0.005. All probabilities are for a 50-year life. Assuming that overload and flooding are unlikely to occur simultaneously, is estimate the probability of failure. I will give you 5 minutes to work this question out. This is essentially a problem based on the Bayes theorem and total probability theorem, but you have to take the correct inferences from this theory given. I'll wait for 2 minutes more. Okay. So P of f given n1 is zero point 0.1. Here it is given that when this accidental traffic overload has occurred, the probability of failure is zero point 0.1, and the probability of that accidental traffic overload happening is 0.01. So P n1 is 0.01. And now this is P f given n2. This is the probability of flooding. So the probability of flooding, under normal conditions means that this accidental overloading has not occurred, so that is 1 minus 0.001, so 0.99, and the probability of failure is much lesser here, 0.002. Now, and this additional probability of failure, that is said that the probability of a flooding occurring has an additional probability of 0.005. So this part is the total probability theorem, zero point zero 0.01 into 0.001 plus 0.002 into 0.99, and plus there is, since there is an additional probability, we have to add it to my total probability of failure, so we are getting 0.008. Now we move on to analysis and prediction. The determination of the probability of failure can be carried out from two viewpoints: analysis of a given state of affairs and prediction of failure probability for some time period in the future. For analysis, the probability density functions of all random variables are presumed known for the time at which the analysis is required. These may, of course, have been obtained from direct observation or from subjective estimates. Similarly, any point estimates for random variables or events are assumed to be known or obtainable for the time at which the analysis is required. If it is assumed that there are no changes to be expected with time in any of the parameters, then the calculated probability estimate may also be used to describe the probability of failure for future times. Comparison to failure data. As better estimates of the various properties and assumptions become available, the subjective probability predictions can be refined. It would be expected that, in the limit, the probability of failure so estimated would approach the probability of failure for similar structures. This assumes that subjective estimates tend to approximate objective, the frequentist data, as the information available improves. With time, and with engineering research, and with practical experiences with actual structures over many years, the proportion of the structural behavioral phenomenon that are unknown or poorly understood decreases. So, such changes need not always be gradual and may have major changes, for example, as a result of structural failure. Overall, the net is that with time and practical experience, the likelihood of structural failure from unknown or poorly understood phenomena tends to decrease. This should this also should decrease the probability of failure from human error, although it is possible that the proportion of failures caused by human error will increase as technical uncertainties decrease. This is a graph showing structural phenomena versus time. So human error failures is this zone, technical failures is this zone, research and experience is here, unknown and poorly understood structural phenomenon is here, This is known structure behaviors. This is engineering capability. This is a schematic representation of the development of understanding of structural phenomena with time and research, and the reduction of probability of failure from related technical failure, and possible increase in the proportion of failures from human error. Criteria for risk acceptability. One criterion is to compare the calculated probability of structural failure with other risks in society, and from these to infer acceptable or tolerable risk for criteria. Now this is what a limit that we have to set. We are calculating a probability of failure of a certain structural element. How will we say that whether it is acceptable or not? How much risk is acceptable? So that is another subjective call that we have to take. The table below shows a summary of selected risks in society based largely on historical data but unlikely to have changed much with time. So, this is the table. Selected risks in society. These are the activities and these are the approximate death rates. This is the exposure and this is the typical risk of death. So, this is the approximate death rate to 10 to the power minus 9. So, some of these have really, really less. Like train travel, car travel, these have much higher exposure and much lesser probability of approximate death rate. These are the final figures. So it is seen that there is a difference or of about one order of magnitude between the so-called voluntary risks and the involuntary or background risks, and that the risks depend on the degree of exposure to the hazard, that is on the potential consequences. So this means that, for example, if for an adventure sports that is a voluntary risk, we are going to people tend to accept a higher degree of risk for that. But in involuntary risks like car travel, airplane travel, that we consider as essentials or everyday activities, there people tend to accept less risk. So they are more rigid. So they demand a greater reliability for those activities. Generally, people are confident in their use of engineered structures in the expectation that they will not fail. Of course, that is what is inherent in us. When we are staying in a building, when we are traveling in a car or train, we assume, we take for granted that they are not going to fail. But that is not the case when we are going for an adventure sports or this kind of, like the alpine climbing, boating, swimming. These are more risky considerations than, because we know that it is risky, people accept that it is risky, so they are ready to accept a greater risk. Hence the probability of failure structure may be related to involuntary risk. Acceptable risk criterion in society. From the risks that are encountered in society, various bodies, including regulators of hazardous industries such as nuclear facilities, chemical plants, etc., have developed acceptable or tolerable risk levels. These levels must be set. Generally, these are related to consequences, mostly typically death of passers-by and operatives. This is a socio-economic criterion. This is kind of a little bit of heuristics. If failure consequences are to be taken into account, a more general criterion for assessing acceptability of structural failure probability is cost benefit or risk benefit analysis given by the net present value criterion as a cost benefit or the cost risk. Basically, benefit and risk are kind of complementary terms. So this is a mathematical formulation, max B minus CT, where B is the total benefit of the project, CT is the total cost of the project. So we want to maximize our profit against the total cost. And this CI is the initial cost of projects. CQA is the cost of end quality assurance measures. CC is the cost of corrective actions is response to quality assurance measures. CINS is the cost of insurance. CM is the cost of maintenance. PF is the probability of failure of the project. CF is the cost associated with the failure, because that is also something we have to account, something the person who has designed the building or the stakeholders have to pay. There are safety, that there are amount to, there is insurance money or failure compensation cost to be paid in case of failures. And lambda is a nominal factor of safety and E is the vector of QA efforts. So this is what is B is a positive and all these costs are negative. CI minus CQA minus CC minus CINS minus CM, and we do not subtract the quality cost of failure by default, because this CF we have to pay only if the probability of failure has actually occurred, if it has actually failed. So PF into CF. And all costs and the benefit B must be discounted to allow for the effect of time, as in standard cost benefit analysis. Is the nominal probability of failure. The interpretation of probability as a degree of belief is an acceptable one consistent with Bayesian statistics. However, whether PFN can be used to make valid comparison of structural safety needs is to be examined. For PFN to be used as a surrogate for PF and hence to be used validly to compare two alternatives 1 and 2, it is required that PF1 by PF2 should be PFN1 by PFN2. This ratio should be same. This is a requirement. Then we have to look at the target values for nominal failure probabilities. Just as in traditional design goals, a factor of safety having a value of about 1.7 to 2 appears to be appropriate depending on the structure, material consequences, etc. Of course, it cannot be a blanket reliability value for everything that we build. It will depend on the structure, the materials, the consequences, etc. Like, and the nominal probability of failure might be expected similarly to have a target value. For structural design code writing purposes, it is often convenient and appropriate to back calculate this target value from existing practice and to use a similar value for a modified or new code. So this means that suppose we are designing a steel connection and we're using the Indian standard code. There is a design procedure using all the factor of safeties and all. Corresponding to that, we can find a reliability value. We can actually see what is the failure probability of that connection once we have modeled the loads and the materials and everything, and then we are going to get a reliability value that is commonly expressed in the terms of the reliability index beta that we have defined in the last lecture. And now if a new code is to be made, we can use a similar value, and then we can see that whatever safety factors, whatever provisions we are giving will lead to a reliability value of similar order. One proposal is to have a nominal failure probability. PFN is 10 to the power minus 4 mu TL n to the power minus 1, where TL is the structural design life in years, n is the average number of people within or near the structure during the period of use. So, of course, if there are more number of people, the acceptable failure probability should be less. So, it is inversely related. And mu is a social criterion factor. A somewhat different proposal is, if there are some other factors considered here. T, L, and N have the same meaning. A and W are the activity and warning factors respectively. Warning, of course, matters. Warning, the greater the warning, the less the probability of failure. Of course, they are selected as plausible but entirely arbitrary numbers. The use of n to the power minus half rather than n to the power minus 1 clearly suggests that the influence of utility theory notions in which the rate of risk aversion decreases with the number of fatalities. This is an hierarchy of structural reliability measures. The level 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is code level methods. They result in partial factors. 2 is a second moment methods that we are going to look at in the next class. They lead to a nominal failure probability. Exact methods, the transformation methods, lead to a failure probability. Numerical integration and simulation, they also lead to a failure probability, because as we do greater and greater number of simulation, the failure probability that I get nears the actual failure probability. And four decision methods, minimum cost or maximum benefit. That is what the decision methods will result in. And finally, we move to the conclusion of this class. The combined and interrelated effects of human error, gross or otherwise, and human intervention have been shown to be major consideration in the estimation of the probability of structural failure. Better understanding of these factors, coupled with appropriate data from similar structures and design and construction practices, should allow better predictions of failure probability to be made. All such estimates must be seen as subjective or nominal, at least to some degree. For any particular structure, the applicability of probability models for basic variables and the conditions under which the evaluation is valid can be judged only subjectively. Measures of failure probability do not therefore have an absolute objective relative frequency interpretation. However, when high quality models of the structural system, load models, and resistant models, including human error effects are used, estimates of structural failure probability may approach estimates of frequency of structural failure obtained from properly analyzed and carefully dissected data. Nominal measures of failure probability can be used as surrogates or more accurately determined measures if the effects of human error in particular are assumed to be similar for similar situations or structural components. Such nominal measures are particularly useful for design code writing purposes. So that's all for today. Are there any questions? So that is all for today's class. Tomorrow we will look at Monte Carlo simulations and numerical methods.